The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, swallowed by the thick darkness of the surrounding forest. Rain pattered against the windshield as Mark tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. The wipers squeaked rhythmically, failing to clear the fog creeping across the glass. He hated driving at night, especially alone. But there was no turning back. The job interview was in the morning, and the only motel for miles was buried deep in the woods. The GPS voice crackled. Turn left in 500 feet. Mark frowned. There was no road sign, no visible path, just trees pressing close together like silent sentinels. But the GPS insisted. With a reluctant sigh, he flicked on his high beams and veered left. The tires crunched over damp gravel. The further he drove, the more the forest swallowed him. The rain had stopped, yet something about the silence felt wrong. He turned down the radio. No wind, no insects, just his own heartbeat hammering in his chest. Then the GPS spoke again, its voice warbling. Continue for 2 miles. A shadow darted across the road. Mark slammed the brakes. His breath hitched as he scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement, just endless black. He exhaled shakily and pressed on. The road narrowed. The trees on either side loomed taller, branches twisting together overhead like skeletal fingers. His headlights flickered. The GPS stuttered, its voice distorting. 1 mile, turn back, turn back, turn back. His stomach dropped. He tapped the screen, but it went black. Then his headlights caught something ahead. A figure standing dead center in the road. A woman. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress, her soaked hair clinging to her face. Mark's pulse pounded. He honked, but she didn't move. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone. No signal. The woman took a step forward. Mark's breath hitched. He couldn't see her face. Her head twitched to the side in unnatural motion. Another step. Her arms dangled limply at her sides, fingers curling and uncurling. His instincts screamed at him to drive. But as he shifted the car into reverse, something scratched at the window. His head snapped to the side. A hand. Pale, long fingers tapping. Mark whipped around. The woman was now at his hood, her head lolling. A guttural whisper slithered into the car. Let me in. He slammed the gas. The car jolted backward as if skidding on the slick road. But the woman didn't move. Her body didn't react the way it should have. It was like she wasn't real. Mark's tires screeched as he spun the wheel. The woman's head snapped upright, and for the first time he saw her face. There were no eyes, just dark, empty sockets. Her mouth stretched too wide, splitting into a jagged grin. Mark screamed. The world tilted. The car veered off the road. The trees rushed toward him. And then, impact. Darkness. When Mark opened his eyes, he was upside down. Blood dripped into his mouth. His head throbbed. The shattered windshield revealed nothing but the endless, suffocating woods. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled for the seatbelt. Something moved outside. A shadow. The woman. She stood just beyond the broken glass, her body swaying like a marionette. Let me in, she whispered again, but this time it came from inside the car. Mark barely had time to scream before the darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, police found the wreckage. The car was empty. No signs of Mark, just deep, inhuman footprints leading away from the crash, disappearing into the woods. They searched for weeks. They never found him. But sometimes, late at night, drivers on that lonely road report seeing a figure standing in the middle of the street. A woman in white, waiting.
Story number 2.
The house had been abandoned for years. No one in town spoke about it, not openly. If you pressed the old folks at the diner, they'd glance at each other warily and shake their heads, muttering about things best left forgotten. Danny didn't care. He and his friends were 17, drunk on summer and the illusion of invincibility. They'd broken into old houses before. This one, gray and sagging at the edges, swallowed by weeds, was just another conquest. Bet you won't stay the whole night, Greg taunted, grinning around a cigarette. Danny scoffed. Easy money. The others laughed, but the sound was thin. They stood a few yards from the house, none willing to step closer. Even drunk, even high, some instinct held them back. Danny shoved the front door. It groaned open, revealing darkness beyond. The air smelled thick, damp wood, mold, something faintly sour beneath it all. See you losers in the morning, he called, stepping inside. The door swung shut behind him. Inside, the silence was heavy, pressing. Dust coated everything in thick layers. Peeling wallpaper curled away from the walls like dead flesh. Danny pulled out his phone. No signal, he chuckled. Of course. As he moved deeper inside, the floor creaked beneath his weight. The house settled, shifting like an old body stirring from sleep. Then, in the silence, something whispered. Danny froze. It had been faint, just a breath against the edge of hearing. Wind, he told himself. He found what must have once been a living room. An old couch sagged in the middle, its stuffing spilling from gaping wounds. A mirror leaned against the far wall, its surface warped with time. Danny stared at his reflection, and then, in the glass, something behind him moved. He spun around. Nothing. A laugh bubbled up in his throat, shaky and forced. All right, old house, let's get this over with. He settled onto the couch, pulling his hoodie tighter around himself. The night stretched on, thick with unseen movement, the air buzzing with silence too deep, too expectant. And then the whispering came again, low, urgent, words just beneath understanding. Danny's breath hitched. He turned his head slowly. Across the room, the mirror remained unchanged, but his reflection was wrong. It hadn't moved when he had. His chest tightened. He lifted his hand. The Danny in the mirror didn't. It stood still, watching. Then, slowly, too slowly, it smiled. Danny shot to his feet, heart hammering. The whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping, crawling under his skin like insects. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. The reflection was stepping forward. Not in the mirror. Into the room. Danny staggered back. No, no, no. The whispering swelled, filling the space, pressing against his skull. The thing that had been in the mirror, his reflection, but not, cocked its head. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, and then with a sickening crack, its head twisted upside down. Danny ran. The door. The door. He hit the handle, yanked. It wouldn't budge. Behind him, the whispering turned to laughter. Slow, deliberate footsteps creaked across the floor. Danny slammed his fists against the door, screaming. The whispering pressed closer, right behind his ear now. A cold breath on his neck. Let us in. Darkness. They found Danny the next morning. The door stood wide open. He was seated on the floor of the living room, staring blankly at the broken mirror. His face was twisted into a grin, his eyes wide, bloodshot. He never spoke again. But sometimes late at night, when the house stands quiet, you can hear the whispers, still waiting, still hungry.
Story number 3.
The first night in the new house, Claire woke to a noise coming from above her. It was faint, but unmistakable, soft, deliberate scratching. She lay still, her breath shallow. The attic. It was an old house, creaky and settling, but this didn't sound like the harmless groans of old wood. It sounded like something moving. She turned toward her husband, Matt, sleeping peacefully beside her. Maybe a raccoon, she told herself. Maybe mice. She forced herself to relax, let the rhythmic sound of Matt's breathing lull her back to sleep. The next morning, she mentioned it at breakfast. Matt frowned over his coffee. We'll check it out later. But later never came. Matt was stuck at work late, and by the time he got home, he waved off the idea of crawling into a dusty attic. Claire didn't argue. She didn't want to go up there either. That night, the sound returned. It started as scratching, then a slow, steady thump, like something shifting its weight. Claire pulled the blankets tighter around herself, staring up at the ceiling. Thump, thump, thump. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The noise stopped, and then a long, dragging scrape. Claire bit down a scream. She reached for Matt, shaking him. Do you hear that? Matt groaned, half asleep. Huh? The attic, she whispered. There's something in the attic, he grumbled, sitting up. They both listened. Silence. Claire, it's an old house, he muttered. It's probably a branch scraping the roof. Claire clenched her teeth, but she didn't argue. The next morning she climbed the attic stairs alone. It smelled stale, thick with dust and the scent of forgotten things. Dim light filtered through a small, filthy window. Boxes sat in piles, undisturbed. She scanned the room, heart pounding. Nothing. Then, just as she turned to leave, she noticed something. In the farthest corner, where the shadows swallowed the light, the dust was disturbed, like something had been dragged. She swallowed hard, stepping closer. A single footprint. Not hers. Something long, thin, wrong. She backed out, shutting the attic door. That night she locked it. It didn't help. The sounds returned, louder now, scratching, thumping, dragging, and something else, breathing. Claire sat up in bed, heart hammering. The air felt thick, pressing down on her like a weight. She nudged Matt again, but he just mumbled, turning over. The sound was closer tonight, lower, not in the attic anymore, on the stairs. Claire's breath hitched, the soft creak of wood, one step, then another. She gripped the blankets, fingers white-knuckled. A shadow moved just beyond the bedroom door, a long, slow inhalation. Then, knuckles tapping gently against the door. Claire couldn't move, the handle twitched. A pause, and then a voice. Not Matt's, not human. "Let me in." A ragged whisper, dry as dead leaves. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, praying Matt would wake up. The handle rattled harder. The whisper came again, more insistent. "Let me in." Then, silence. The air felt thick, charged, as if something waited just on the other side of the door. Claire stayed awake until the sun rose. The next morning, she made Matt check the attic. He grumbled, grabbing a flashlight. Claire stood at the base of the ladder, watching as he poked his head inside. "Nothing here," he called. "Check the floor," Claire insisted. He sighed, scanning the dust-covered boards. Then he paused. "Okay, that's weird." "What?" "There are footprints up here," he said slowly. Claire's stomach dropped. Matt leaned closer. "They start over there in the corner," he murmured. "But they don't lead anywhere." Claire swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Matt said, climbing down, "it's like something was standing there for a long time." A chill crept up Claire's spine. Matt forced a laugh. "Maybe it's just—" That night, he woke up screaming. Claire bolted upright, grabbing his arm. "Matt!" He was gasping, drenched in sweat. His hands clutched his chest, trembling. "I saw it," he whispered. Claire's blood ran cold. "Saw what?" Matt shuddered, gripping the blankets. "It was standing in the corner of the room," he choked out. "Watching." Claire's skin prickled. "What did it look like?" she asked. Matt shook his head. "It was tall, too tall, arms too long. He shuddered again, burying his face in his hands. "It had no face, Claire, just holes where the eyes should be." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. She turned her head slowly, eyes locking onto the attic door. It was open, just a crack, and from the darkness beyond, something whispered, "Let me in."
Story number 4.
When Ava moved into her new apartment, she wasn't expecting much, just a cheap place close to work, nothing fancy. The building was old, the walls thin, and the floors creaked underfoot, but it was quiet and the rent was unbeatable. The first night was uneventful, except for the strange noise coming from the air vent. She was lying in bed, scrolling through her phone when she heard it. A faint rustling. Probably just dust settling in the ducts, she told herself. She turned off the light and drifted into sleep. The next night, it happened again. A soft, dry sound like fabric brushing against metal. Ava sat up, frowning. She stared at the vent across the room. Something about it felt off. The air in the room was still, yet the slats of the vent seemed to shift slightly, as if adjusting to an unseen breath. She shook the thought away. Just paranoia. Old buildings made noises. But then, just as she pulled the blankets up to her chin, she heard it. A whisper. Not words. Just a faint exhale, carried through the vents. Ava's heart thudded. She forced a laugh. "Jesus, get a grip," she muttered, rolling onto her side, but she didn't sleep easily that night. A week passed, and the noises didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Late at night, when the apartment was silent, she would hear it, shuffling. A slow, deliberate movement inside the walls. Once, she swore she heard something dragging itself through the ducts. She tried to ignore it, until the smell started. It was faint at first. A whiff of something sour when she walked past the vent. By the third night, it was unbearable. Rotten, stale sweat, and something worse. Something dead. She called the landlord. "Probably a rat," he said dismissively. "I'll send someone next week." Ava clenched her teeth. "Next week it reeks." "Lady, I don't know what to tell you," he sighed. Welcome to cheap rent. That night, she taped over the vents. She could still smell it, still hear it. And then, at 2:47 a.m., she woke with a start. A noise. Not from the vent this time, from her closet. Ava held her breath. The door was open just a crack. She stared at the darkness beyond, heart hammering. Something moved. A slow shuffle of fabric. Ava's throat tightened. The air was heavy, electric, with something wrong. Then, in the silence, a dry, rasping inhale. Not hers. Ava sat frozen, body screaming to run, but too afraid to move. The closet door creaked. Just an inch. Then another. Ava's breath came in short, panic bursts. A shadow shifted in the darkness. And then a single pale hand emerged from the gap. Long fingers. Too long. Moving like a spider, curling against the frame. Ava shot out of bed, sprinting for the door. She didn't look back. Didn't breathe until she was in the hallway, her shaking hands fumbling for her phone. She called the cops. By the time they arrived, her apartment was empty. No sign of forced entry. Nothing in the vents, nothing in the closet. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but they searched the place anyway. Finally, one of them sighed. Look, ma'am, you sure you didn't have a nightmare? Ava's mouth was dry. She knew what she saw, what she heard, but she nodded anyway. The cops left. Ava didn't sleep that night. The next day, she packed. She didn't care about the lease. She was leaving. As she hauled a box toward the door, her foot knocked something over. A metal grate. She frowned, looking up. The vent cover had fallen from the ceiling, and behind it, darkness. A hole leading into the air duct. The rotten smell hit her full force. Ava gagged, covering her nose. She reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness. Her stomach lurched. Clothing, a crumpled blanket, empty food wrappers, a nest. Someone had been living in her vents. Then, just beyond the light's reach, a face, wide, bulging eyes staring right at her. Ava screamed. The thing moved, scuttling backward like an insect, disappearing into the ducts. Ava ran, leaving everything behind. She never went back. The police searched the vents the next day. They never found him, just the remnants of his presence. And a single message scratched into the metal. I watched you sleep.
Story number 5.
The first call came at 12:17 a.m. Rachel was half asleep when the phone on her nightstand buzzed, the vibration rattling against the wood. Groggy, she fumbled for it, squinting at the unknown number flashing across the screen. She hesitated. It was late, maybe a wrong number. The phone stopped ringing. Rachel exhaled, rolling over. Then, the second call came. 12:18 a.m. Same number. A prickle of unease ran through her. She let it ring, waiting for the voicemail. Nothing. She turned the phone to silent and set it back down. As soon as her head hit the pillow, the third call. Rachel's pulse quickened. She sat up, staring at the screen. Something about this didn't feel right. Finally, with shaking fingers, she answered. She didn't speak. Neither did they. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint, shuddering breath, the kind you hear when someone's standing too close. Rachel's skin went cold. Who is this? She whispered. Silence. Then the voice. Low. Hoarse. I see you. Rachel's stomach clenched. She hung up. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps as she stared at the phone. A prank, she told herself. Just a stupid prank. But then, a notification. A picture message. Rachel's hands trembled as she tapped it open. Her bedroom. Taken from outside her window. Her blood turned to ice. The curtains were open. A surge of panic sent her scrambling to the window, yanking the curtains shut. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? Would they take her seriously? Her phone vibrated again. A text. Don't hide. Rachel's breath hitched. Her apartment was on the second floor. The only way to her window was by the fire escape. Slowly, her eyes drifted toward it. The faintest shadow moved beyond the curtain. Someone was out there. Rachel grabbed the lamp from her nightstand, heart pounding. She took a step forward. Then, a sharp knock at the window. Rachel screamed, stumbling backward. The knocking came again. Slow, deliberate. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to breathe. Seconds passed. Then, silence. Rachel dared to peek through the curtain. Nothing. The fire escape was empty. Had they left? Her phone buzzed. Another text. See you soon. Rachel's blood ran cold. The calls stopped after that. But every night at exactly 12:17 a.m. she felt it. The weight of unseen eyes. Watching. Waiting. And sometimes, just before she fell asleep, she swore she heard the faintest tap against the glass.
Story number 6.
Lisa moved into the apartment on a Tuesday. It was cheap, close to work, and furnished with mismatched furniture left behind by the previous tenant. The landlord barely spoke to her, just handed over the keys and mumbled something about the mirror in the bedroom. Lisa hadn't paid much attention at the time. She should have. The mirror was large and old, standing against the far wall. It had no frame, just a smooth, cold surface with faint smudges she couldn't quite wipe away. At first, she barely noticed it. Then strange things started happening. It began subtly. Things in the reflection didn't quite match reality. One night, as Lisa was brushing her teeth, she noticed something odd. The toothpaste tube on the counter was facing the wrong way in the mirror. She turned, checking the real tube. No, it was fine. She laughed it off. Guess I'm just tired. But the discrepancies didn't stop. The next evening, as she lay in bed reading, she glanced up and froze. The reflection of the lamp beside her was off. In the mirror, the light was dimmer, casting a sickly yellow glow. Lisa's stomach twisted. She turned to look at the real lamp. It was bright and warm. She looked back at the mirror. Her reflection was watching her, not reading, just staring. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She squeezed her eyes shut, taking a slow breath. When she looked again, everything was normal. She barely slept that night. By the third day, Lisa convinced herself it was all in her head. But then something happened she couldn't ignore. She was getting ready for bed, standing at the sink, when she caught movement in the mirror. Not hers. Something in the corner of the reflection. A shadow. Lisa turned. Nothing was there. She whipped her head back to the mirror and saw it, a figure, standing in the reflection of her bedroom doorway. It was tall, almost touching the ceiling. Its limbs were long and wrong, fingers stretching too far, and its face, there wasn't one. Just smooth, pale skin where eyes and a mouth should be. Lisa's breath hitched. She turned. The doorway was empty. Slowly, heart hammering, she looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer. Lisa stumbled backward, her pulse a frantic drumbeat. She squeezed her eyes shut. It's not real. It's not real. When she opened them, the figure was gone. The mirror showed only her reflection. But something had changed. Her reflection was smiling. Lisa wasn't. A slow, wide grin stretched across its face, and then it raised a hand and waved. Lisa ran. She spent the night in her car, gripping the steering wheel, eyes locked on the darkened apartment window. By morning, she made a decision. She was getting rid of the mirror. When she returned, everything was still. Normal. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming the cold, silent apartment. The mirror stood in the same place, harmless. Lisa swallowed her fear and grabbed a bedsheet, throwing it over the glass. She didn't care if it was expensive. She didn't care if the landlord got mad. She was taking it out. She hauled it through the apartment, struggling under its weight, and shoved it into the hallway. As she turned to go back inside, something made her pause. A sound. Soft, like fingernails scratching against glass. Lisa's stomach twisted. Slowly, dreading what she would see, she lifted the sheet. Her reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the empty hallway. A deep, suffocating dread filled her chest. Then in the corner of the mirror, movement. Not her reflection. Something else. A pale hand pressed against the inside of the glass. Then another. A face emerged, stretching forward as if pushing through a thin layer of skin. The same faceless thing from before. It tilted its head, sensing her. Lisa staggered back, her throat closing. The thing inside the mirror pressed harder. The glass bulged outward. Cracks snaked along its surface. Lisa turned and ran. Behind her, a deafening shatter, and then a whisper, right against her ear. "I'm out." The next tenant found the apartment abandoned. Lisa's belongings were still there. Her car parked outside. The only thing missing was her. But on the floor, amidst the shattered glass, was her reflection, grinning, waiting.
Story number 7.
It started on a Sunday. Hannah was coming home late from a friend's apartment. It was just past midnight, and the subway station was nearly empty. The platform lights flickered, casting long, uneven shadows along the tiled floor. She stood near the edge, scrolling through her phone, waiting for the train. Then she noticed him. A man, standing at the far end of the platform. He was tall, too thin, dressed in a wrinkled suit. His head hung low, his face obscured by messy hair. Something about him made her uneasy. He wasn't waiting for the train. He was facing her. Still, unmoving. Hannah glanced away, trying to ignore the creeping chill in her spine. When she looked up again, the man was closer. He hadn't moved, at least not that she had seen. But now he was only 20 feet away. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Maybe he was just a drunk, or someone waiting for a different train. She looked away again. The train's headlights appeared in the distance, rounding the tunnel bend. When she turned back, the man was 5 feet away. And now she could see his face. His mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. His eyes, too large, too bright, stared at her unblinking. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just smiled. Hannah's stomach twisted. The train screeched into the station. She turned, rushing toward the doors as they slid open. She didn't dare look back. She stepped inside, heart hammering, gripping the pole as the train lurched forward. For a moment she felt safe. Then she saw the reflection in the window. The man was standing on the platform, watching her, still smiling. Then, just as the train pulled away, his head tilted, and his mouth moved. No sound, just 2 silent words. "See you soon?" Hannah barely slept that night. She double-checked the locks, closed all the curtains, told herself it was just a creepy guy on the subway. But when she left for work the next morning, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. Across the street, half hidden behind a lamppost, the smiling man. She froze. His face was unchanged. That awful, stretched grin, those two wide eyes, watching, waiting. She hurried to work, heart racing. By the time she got there, he was gone. She told herself it was a coincidence, a bad dream, maybe. But that night, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she saw him again, standing at the end of the hallway, still, silent, his grin wider than before. Hannah's hand shook as she unlocked her door, slamming it shut behind her. She checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. For a long time, she stood frozen, her breath ragged. Was she going crazy? She forced herself into bed, pulling the covers tight around her. The room was dark, silent. And then, a whisper, right outside her door. Knock, knock! Hannah's breath caught. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The doorknob rattled, once, twice, then silence. The air felt thick, pressing down on her chest. She lay awake until sunrise, her body rigid with terror. When she finally dared to check the peephole, he was gone. But something had been left behind. A single white business card slipped under the door. There was no name, no number, just 2 words written in red ink. Still smiling. Hannah didn't go to work that day. She barely moved, barely breathed, jumping at every creak of the old apartment walls. By nightfall, exhaustion weighed on her, but she refused to sleep. At midnight, her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Let me in. Hannah's stomach turned. Her fingers trembled as she typed back. Who are you? 3 dots appeared. Then a photo followed. It was her apartment door. From the outside. She screamed, dropping the phone. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the room. 1, 2, 3. She clamped a hand over her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. The knob turned. Locked. But something slid under the door. Another business card. This time in thick black ink. You're smiling now, too. Hannah reached up, touching her lips. Her fingers came away wet. Blood. Her mouth, it was stretched into a grin. Wide. Uncontrollable. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop smiling.
Story number 8.
The storm rolled in just after midnight. Heavy rain lashed against the windshield as Mark drove down the winding road, eyes squinting against the darkness. The directions on his GPS flickered, struggling to keep a signal. He had never been to this part of town before. Rural, quiet, far from the city's glow. The roads were lined with dense trees, their twisted branches forming skeletal fingers against the night sky. Mark sighed. He should have left earlier. His friend James had invited him to stay the weekend at his family's lake house. It's isolated, James had warned. No neighbors, barely any phone reception. But it's peaceful. Mark wasn't feeling peaceful now. He followed the final turn indicated by his GPS, pulling onto a narrow gravel road. The headlights illuminated an old house at the end of the drive. It was larger than he expected. 3 stories, weathered wood, a steeply pitched roof. The windows were dark. Mark parked and grabbed his bag. His phone buzzed just as he stepped out. James, hey man, you almost here? Roads are nasty. Mark frowned, glancing up at the house. Yeah, I just pulled up. A pause. Then, no, you didn't. Mark's stomach dropped. A slow chill crawled up his spine. What do you mean? He typed back, glancing around. Lightning flashed. For a split second, the world was bathed in white, and Mark saw it. The front door of the house was slightly ajar, just wide enough for someone to be watching, waiting. His phone buzzed again. Mark, where are you? The lake house is a mile past the old Miller place. You're not at the right house. A heavy silence settled over the night. The wrong house. Mark turned to his car. The driver's side door was open. Had he left it like that? No. He was sure he had closed it. His hands shook as he stepped backward. Then, a sound from inside the house. A slow, deliberate creak of wood, like footsteps on an old floor. Mark's breathing grew ragged. Someone was in there, watching him. Then, in the stillness, a whisper, not from the house, from his phone. A voice, distorted through static. Don't turn around. Mark's body locked up. He could feel it. Something behind him, standing, waiting. A warm breath, too close to his ear. His heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. Slowly, as if controlled by something outside himself, his fingers moved. He switched his phone camera to front-facing mode, raised it, and looked at the screen. His reflection stared back. But he wasn't alone. A tall figure loomed behind him, its face stretched, hollow. A grin, too wide, curling at the edges. Mark dropped the phone and ran. He didn't look back. Didn't stop. Branches scraped his skin as he tore through the woods, rain blinding his vision. Behind him, the sound of footsteps, matching his pace. Then, suddenly, a light. Mark burst onto a gravel road, panting, heart slamming against his ribs. Up ahead, a cabin, its porch light glowing. James. Mark staggered forward, collapsing onto the porch. The door swung open. James' eyes widened. Jesus, Mark, what the hell happened? Mark couldn't speak. His mind replayed the image on his phone. That thing. That smile. James helped him inside, locking the door. Dude, you're bleeding. Mark touched his arm. Shallow cuts crisscrossed his skin. Branches, probably. Probably. James handed him a towel, glancing outside. You must have gone to the Miller house, he said grimly. No one lives there. Not anymore. Mark swallowed hard. I think someone does. James frowned. Mark took a shaky breath, gripping his phone with trembling hands. He lifted it. The screen was cracked, but still working. The last image was still there, the thing behind him, the grin. But the longer he stared, the worse it got. Because now, it was closer, and he wasn't in the picture anymore. Just the figure, smiling, as if it had taken his place.